it's time to start. I'm going to begin us in prayer. Almighty God, Heavenly Father, who has blessed us with the joy and care of children, give us light and strength so to train them that they may love whatsoever things are true and pure and lovely and of good report, following the example of their Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, this is our 5th week and next to last in this lecture. And tonight we're going to look at the 3rd pillar of St. John Chrysostom's Christian education, and that is his emphasis on storytelling. I think most parents already know how important reading to our children, storytelling and this sort of thing, and how important that is. But we're going to see tonight what the saint has to say about it, and also why it's important, what storytelling does to the soul. So hopefully this will be illuminating to everyone. Okay, so St. John Chrysostom took a broad view of storytelling. He considered them anything as long as it had a narrative. So he'll speak of gossip as a negative form of storytelling, old wives' tales, pagan epics, and of course Bible stories, which he encourages. So anything is a story if there's some sort of narrative that is being absorbed by the child for good or ill. So he had a very broad understanding of what it meant to tell a story. Okay, so he was flexible. He was flexible in this. And what was of key importance to him was that the story did not undermine biblical truth, but instead illuminated biblical truth. Okay, so doesn't matter the form the story takes, is it pointing to the truth of the Creator? That is what is important. Okay. And at one point he wrote, or of course this would be in a homily, he said to parents, "For childhood is an age full of folly, and to this folly are superadded the bad examples derived from heathen tales, where they are made acquainted with those heroes so admired among them, slaves of their passions and cowards with regard to death, as, for example, Achilles, when he relents, when he dies for his concubine, when another gets drunk, and many other things of this sort." So childhood is an age of folly. And then he proceeds at one point to use the story of Jacob and Esau to illuminate how parents can use a biblical story and unfold it over time, over a series of nights, in weeks and months, to reveal more and more of God's truth to the child. He says, "See how many fair lessons this biblical story begets, and do not follow it right through to the end, but rather see how many lessons this part begets. First, children learn to reverence and honor their fathers. When they see so keen a rivalry for their father's blessing," that is the rivalry between Jacob and Esau, "and they will sooner suffer a myriad of stripes than to hear their parents curse them. If a story can so master the children's soul that it is thought worthy of belief, the veritable truth, it will surely enthrall them and fill them with great awe." And he goes on and he reveals different aspects of the story and what it can reveal to the child or children as you are going through it. He says, don't rush through it. And interestingly enough, he also gives sort of advice on parents on age appropriateness. For example, St. John Chrysostom didn't believe that you should teach children anything about hell until they were teenagers. So he had this sense of what is appropriate for the age of your child. And he didn't want you to get into graphic detail until they were old enough to be able to absorb this.
Yeah, and
Oh, question?
So there's a presumption, I guess, that you're reading to a child,
Yes.
Or is it let the child absorb the story as is, and these things come out?
Okay, so the question is about, is there just an implication that you are letting the child work this out as they hear it, or are you sort of teasing it out in a discussion with them? He actually did want you to tease it out in a discussion, and I'll share some other quotes from him where you will see him do this. And eventually you'll even see a point where he encourages the parents to, okay, they've heard this story over and over, they know it by heart, now let them tell you the story and see how it is imprinted on their heart. Okay. So, in the classical scheme of education, the chief means of moral education is storytelling. Now that's a quote from one of my favorite Catholic ethicists, Alistair MacIntyre. Alistair MacIntyre, who writes about classical education, a return to classical education, and it being story-driven. And what he has to say, I think, helps us understand where St. John Chrysostom's coming from, because remember, St. John received a classical education. That was the best of his time period. That was pretty much the only education of his time period. But St. John tempers classical education, again, with the alignment to biblical truth being the measure to which a story is judged by. So again, he's very flexible on what it means to tell a story. It just has to have a narrative. So negative forms of this can be gossip, slander, and what we would call old wives' tales or superstitions. He sees biblical stories, of course, as the best in revealing God's truth, but he's actually okay with, we would call it secular, but in his day, pagan stories, as long as they didn't diminish or conceal the source of truth in any way. So he's very flexible on what it means to do this. So the biblical truth is the measure to judge the story by. So, like Father Rooney, we have to talk a bit about tradition. Okay, he has unfolded in his lessons how we are a part of a tradition with the capital T, that being the tradition of God. So how does tradition manifest itself in this, in the inculcating of virtue within in children through storytelling? And you might want to go check the nursery. Okay. So, according to Alistair MacIntyre, tradition is a set of practices, we might call them virtues, habituated by a community which enables the pursuit of a goal that the community shares. Okay? And he would say there is no community free of tradition. Every community has tradition. Even communities that pride themselves on being anti-tradition. And there are such communities that openly reject the idea of passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. They want to separate themselves from that, reject it. But this too is a tradition when you do something like that. Okay, you cannot escape it. Okay? And Christianity is the tradition, and the tradition in which we are a part of. So as we talked about a few weeks ago with the Scacies, our tradition with a capital T also has a set of practices. These are the spiritual exercises. And they're habituated by our community, right, in the pursuit of a goal. And what is our goal? Of course, our goal is Christ likeness, the goal of the end of the human purpose, of true humanity, becoming like Christ. So yes, tradition is all important in this discussion. But ancient thinkers like Aristotle, he viewed tradition as a sort of craft. So techne in Greek is where we get, technological. It means craft. Okay? And so the classical view of tradition is that it is like a craft. Okay? Every craft has an end purpose. So if you're a shoemaker, your craft is to make a fine pair of shoes. That is the end goal. right? If you are a Christian parent, your end goal is to make a fine Christian, right? With the help of God. So it is a craft. So a master of a craft, if we use this language, teaches his pupil or his apprentice the art and the skill of the craft. He teaches the best practices and standards with the hope that the disciple will then master these in their efforts to perfect the craft and become a master themselves. And this gets carried on through time as it's handed down by master to apprentice, and every once in a few generations you might get a prodigy that rises up, and then you have a new best practice to be passed down. So tradition is living. It is living. And the whole community of practitioners are involved in the craft, even those that have already passed on. Okay? Because their contributions to the craft remain, even if they are no longer among the living. So Aristotle would say tradition is a techne. Okay. And then, how does tradition relate with time? With time. So MacIntyre believed that tradition was the historical dimension of virtue, of this practice of virtue being handed down from one generation to the next. So he saw it as the connection of the virtues with our past. When one enters into a tradition, one is immediately in relationship with other practitioners. Not only with living members, but with the practitioners of the past whose deeds and contributions continue to influence the present. So, as converts into orthodoxy, I know I experienced this feeling of being immediately in a community with practitioners of the faith. Okay, I have an immediate connection, even if I had not met everybody or don't know everyone by name. There's this immediate connection with the others that have this shared belief, and I also felt an immediate connection with the saints, right? The practitioners of the past, but they are still involved with the present and with the faith. So this idea of tradition being sort of with us in time, right? This historical dimension. So, a community. Tradition is a story-formed community. A story-formed community. In the case of the church, it is God's story of salvation. And we, the church, are the community that practices the spiritual exercise and tells and continues to tell the story of salvation from one generation to the next. From one generation to the next. So when we start to teach our children Bible stories and other Christ-centered stories, we are introducing them to their story, and they are living into their story. It's interesting, I don't have a slide about this, but at one point, Alistair MacIntyre goes into great detail on how he believes that we are story-formed souls. The human being is a story-formed creature with a beginning, middle, and an end, and that we all see ourselves as the main character of our own story. No one sees themselves as kind of the extras in the back, right? We're the main character in our own story. This is how we think. This is how we see the world. And when somebody loses their ability to see themselves within a story with a chronological sense of the past, present, and future, that's when you have sort of the contemplation of suicide begin to form, okay? Because they have lost the meaning. They have lost the meaning of the story and their part in it. And time, everything has become disjointed and disconnected. Okay? There's also a sense of alienation because you're outside of the community of the story now as well. Okay, did you have a question?
So that sense is so strong that it actually destroys your sense, your desire to live?
That was his theory, that losing your sense of your own story or your part in a broader story can damage your ability to yes, want to continue. Yeah, it is very serious. So that we are story formed creatures. Okay, so a unique mark of our faith, which is also a tradition, the tradition, is that it is theandric. So both God and man, right? So the church is instituted by the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, and it is truly an institution, really created by God, just like marriage is an institution created by God. So is the church, okay? And the spiritual exercises, right? Those virtues that are really the fruits of the Spirit, okay? They're only possible through God's grace, as well as imitation of Spirit-filled mentors. This is why it's important to raise your children in the church, because then you're not the only patterns and examples to follow. There's the elders of the community your children can also look up to, right? Brothers and sisters in the faith, patterns to follow, how we do this. Okay, so this is the life of faith, but storytelling can also be Spirit-guided and Spirit-filled, right? We are part of God's story of redemptive history, we could call it redemptive history, the story of salvation. And as St. John Chrysostom held to a broad understanding of what made a story, then it can take many forms, even those that did not exist in his day. Even art forms of storytelling that did not exist in his day. Because, hey, if gossip and slander, if he considers that a story, he can also consider something like literature to be a story, even if it did not exist in that form of this day, in his day. So the novel, think of the novel. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little brief history of storytelling over time. Okay, so going back to prehistory, we know archaeology has told us and historians have showed us with evidence that storytelling has been part of human life from the beginning. Every family, tribe, and civilization has told their oral traditions over time. You do not have to be literate. Okay, oral tradition came first. Oral tradition came first, or telling the story of their origins came before written tradition. Okay? And as written language emerged, so did the epics, such as Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BC. And parts of that epic refer to a much older story that we would recognize as Noah in the flood. So you could see how different peoples around the Fertile Crescent have a shared history, and it's coming through in their oral traditions, and then one comes along that is literate now, and they're starting to write these things down. And we would recognize it in a different form in Genesis. Okay? And then after antiquity, when you move into the Middle Ages, we see the chanson emerge. That's just the French word for song. The most famous, perhaps, is the Song of Roland. These songs were tales told featuring ideal archetypes, ideal heroes who were performing symbolically charged actions. Okay? There is no interior world in a chanson. It's all exterior, meaning you don't get to get inside the hero's head. It doesn't matter. It's his actions, his symbolically charged actions that matter. Okay? So this was how story was told throughout the Middle Ages, the chanson. And then modernity came up with its own art form of storytelling, which we see. This is called the Roman style, but really this is where we end up with the novel. Okay, the Roman style of writing emerges with Don Quixote in 1605. The novel was a new kind of story that encapsulated metaphysical truths that could not be easily digested any other way. This emerged at the point when uncertainty about the world and our place in it was shattering the medieval mindset. Okay, so people are beginning to think differently. They're beginning to abandon their father's way of thinking, including their father's way of thinking of tradition. The world is being emptied of the sacred, or at least the perception of the sacred, and it's becoming flatter. Okay, you might say it's becoming flatter. So what happens, an art form emerges where you start to see for the first time heroes where you could get into their mind and see what they're thinking. And so the novel was essentially driven by the Protestant Reformation and its change in emphasis. So the spiritual realm is now in the interior of the self, not in the external world like in the chanson. Okay? So the world had been once dense with supernatural meaning. Everything had meaning during the Middle Ages and before that point in antiquity and prehistory. But now the world is being emptied of transcendent reality. So the novel is an art form which is trying to hold on to some of that deeper meaning because it seems to be disappearing in the world around. And that, of course, this means uncertainty is entering hearts. The medieval mind was not uncertain about whether God existed. You won't find atheists in medieval Europe, okay? Because everyone sort of had the same worldview. But with changes, and I'm not going to get too much into intellectual history, you have uncertainties start to appear. Is there truly more than what we just see in the material? So this is happening at this point. Okay, so there's an American journalist and a professor, Joseph Bottom, who wrote a whole book on the novel, which is very interesting. And in it, he says, the novel came into being to present the Protestant story of the individual soul as it strove to understand its salvation and achieve its sanctification. Illustrated by the parallel journey of the new style characters with their well-furnished interiors as they wander through their adventures in the exterior world. So it's ironic because Don Quixote, that was written by a Roman Catholic. But you have the Protestants pick up on this new art form of the novel, and you see them flourish all throughout Europe. The Victorians are particularly known for refining it up to a certain level. So we have great novels coming out of the 19th century during the Victorian period. But you also have great novels being written in Russia, which is Orthodox at this point. Okay. But Joseph Bottom comes to the conclusion that we live in a time when the novel has died. So if the novel was an art form of storytelling that was meant to take you on a sort of vicarious journey with the main protagonist, the hero of the story, as they go through a conversion experience and find God on this road to sanctification or theosis or spiritual transcendence, books like this are no longer being written. And
Since when?
since Joseph Bottom indicates, you start to really see the decline and death of the novel right around, say, late 80s, 90s, but it had been declining for a while. And a lot of this has to do with World War I and the rise of existentialism and nihilism and on and on. You see a decline in the desire of the storyteller wanting to continue on this great Christian tradition. So once written for an adult audiences, what ended up happening to the novel? Novels, the great Christian art form, are now considered to be children's literature. As though books about truth, good and evil, and the human condition are only suitable for the young, those whom have not matured to a suitable age of nihilism or atheism or whatever you want to, whatever descriptor that you want to put there. But the good news is, even if great books are not being written anymore in this style, we have a huge treasury of them dating back to Don Quixote, and we can use them as parents and read them to our children and read them for ourselves, because they will transform us as well, right? And I will show you how. Remember last week I said imitation isn't just about imitating the desires of the other who are living, but we could also imitate models who are fictional. So this is where storytelling meets up with this idea of imitation and imitating a pattern of behavior. It meets up in the stories we tell in that great tradition, but it does some other things as well. We're going to look at what this kind of storytelling can do. So going back to René Girard, we discussed him last week in regard to imitation. Well, he started really his investigation and discovery about the importance of imitation as he was teaching the great books, the great European novels, as a professor. And he started writing a book on the novel, and that's where he starts picking up how the characters in these great books are imitating the desires of each other, and he originally calls it triangular desire. So his theory and his discovery about the importance of imitation started with the novel, and he calls this novelistic truth. And in that first book that he wrote, the French title was The Romantic Lie and the Novelistic Truth, so there's this idea of truth coming out of the novel. You had a question?
Do you know if this was before or after his conversion?
He went through his conversion as he was writing the last chapter. So as he was following the great characters of the novels that he was teaching to his college students, he was in the 60s or so, late 50s, early 60s, he came to Christ as well. And he has a great deal to say about the novelistic conversion of characters and how they all share similar attributes. So the novel being such a powerful art form, Christian art form, that it could literally bring an atheist to Christ, just reading a whole bunch of these books. So these are worthy to be read to our children, as long as we watch for the age appropriateness of, starting with for example, I'm reading to my son the C.S. Lewis Narnia books right now, and he's able to grasp them very well and glean moral clarity from them. So Girard found that, as he, quote, literature accurately described human relationships long before psychology, anthropology, and sociology were established as academic disciplines. So he was like, you could find more truth about the human condition in reading these great books than you can digging through the human psyche in these Enlightenment age disciplines. And what he discovered in literature was the genesis of his major theory on imitation in culture. So this is very important. Okay, another aspect of what storytelling is doing to the soul, and particularly the soul of the child as well as the parent, because this is happening both ways. I'm having to read the canon of great books myself as a teacher here at St. Peter's, so it is affecting my soul spiritually as well as the children that I'm teaching to. You see how that works? So it's a two-way thing. The parent and the child are both growing. Our spirits are growing through this. So stories are not only expose us to another world, right? It takes part in the, quote, winning of the mind from wickedness to virtue. Winning of the mind from wickedness to virtue. Stories provide vicarious practice, and they fill the inner moral landscape of the child or of the reader. So you're furnishing your inner world with beauty, truth, and goodness. This is what's happening. So there's another literature professor who's written a book. This is Dr. Pryor. And she picks up on this because as she has taught students literature for over 20 years, she wrote, literature embodies virtue. First, by offering images of virtue in action, so a pattern, there's something to imitate, okay, a model. And second, by offering the reader vicarious practice in exercising virtue, which is not the same as actual practice, of course, but is nonetheless a practice by which habits of the mind and ways of thinking and perceiving accrue. So this is the idea of that ancient quote, character is destiny. Okay, so if our actions define us, where are our actions coming from? Well, they're coming from what's inside. Okay, and what we do affects what we do inside. So there's this, so she's saying that this vicarious practice of the virtue, as you are sort of walking in the shoes of the hero that you're reading about, it's creating certain ways of thinking so that when the time comes and you're faced with a situation in reality, in real time, you're already used to thinking a certain way. And that's going to affect how you respond in actions to whatever that you're confronted with. So she calls this habits of the mind, ways of thinking and perceiving accrue through this vicarious practice of virtue through the characters of our books. So, and this is a quote from her. It's rather long, but it's worth it. She continues, she says, in portraying virtue and vice in action, great works of literature provide vicarious experience in exercising virtue or bearing the consequences of vice. Want to know what happens when we cast off all internal and external restraints? Read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I would not suggest reading that to your young child, though. Right. Want to witness the destructive power of vengeance? Read Shakespeare's Hamlet. Want to examine the implications of existential worldview? Read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Want to encounter indestructibility of the human spirit? Read Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. Okay. The process of evaluating characters in literature, good, bad, or a mixture of both, like most everything else in life, is a process that shapes our own character. It is a virtue-building exercise. She said even sitting down and reading a book, a classic, could think of them, some of them are very thick. And it takes a while to get used to them because a lot of them are written in the 19th or 18th century and we're not used to how people spoke then. She said even attempting to read one is an exercise of the virtue of patience and perseverance. Learning how to read a book all the way to the end, that is an exercise of perseverance. So it's all part of the package. But are you beginning to see what John Chrysostom meant, what St. John meant when he talked about our children being a city and our 5 senses are the gates of the city and how important it is to control what is going into the city? So if all of this is true about storytelling, then it's very important that we are being mindful of what stories we're letting our children absorb, because all of this is going on. So if you give your child something mindless, something lacking in moral clarity, or something that is outright immoral, it's doing the same thing. It's doing the same thing. But it's not going to be inculcating virtue. It's going to be inculcating other habits of the mind, perhaps habits that we don't want them to develop. Okay. So we have an Orthodox philosopher, theologian, and ethicist, Vigen Grurian, and he wrote this beautiful little book published by Oxford Press called Tending the Heart of Virtue. And he actually was consulted for St. Peter's Classical, when the school first came into being, he is considered a very important voice in this field of classical education. So he said, okay, he talks about the moral imagination, and he said, think of it as if your child's imagination is like a garden, okay, a garden to be cultivated, okay. So we want to cultivate it with beautiful plants and beautiful trees, right, and sweet smelling and fragrant and just this lovely image, right. I think at one point C.S. Lewis even talks this way. He said, a child starts out with a desert. It's your job to irrigate the desert. So again, this language of the child's mind. So, and he goes on in his little book to say children gain moral clarity through these classic children's stories. Okay, this is how they're getting, and children want moral clarity. Why? Going back a couple weeks ago, remember, or last week, our human capacities, what makes us the image and likeness of God, part of them are these moral capacities that God has put in us. They're innate to us. So children are naturally receptive to learning morality. That's how God made us. So they're desiring moral clarity. So he said, the most beautiful words that you could hear from your child as you're reading to them at bedtime is he good or bad? Is she a good witch or a bad witch? Like, give your child a moral clarity. Let them know. Let them know. And he goes on to say, unlike what is being taught in many schools, this idea, this theory of value clarification, which is the concept of children should just be taught how to come up with their own moral code. They just need to learn. All you need to teach them is how to clarify their own beliefs. He said, no, this is not what we're looking for. He said, it's ridiculous to demand that a child create their own morality. He said, we don't ask them to create their own language, and we don't expect them to invent their own math. So don't do this with your child. Give them the moral clarity as you're reading to them or watching what films. We'll get into theater in a little bit as a form of storytelling. So children want that moral clarity. And going back to St. John Chrysostom on storytelling, he said, here's some advice to parents. Make your stories agreeable, that they may give the child pleasure and his soul may not grow weary. Right? So find the best. Find the best. Okay? Don't bore them with banal stories. And he says, so he's very opinionated on the theater, but remember, he's living in a time that is still very much pagan, and the theater was still pagan. So his opinion was, never send your son to the theater that he may not suffer utter corruption through his ears and eyes. Let us devise for him other harmless pleasures. Let us give him recreation. Let us show our regard for him by many gifts, so that his soul may patiently bear out our rejection of the theater. I love that, because he's saying, yes, his friends are all going to go to see that movie.
But it could be talking about today.
We could be talking about today. Although we have more appropriate options. There are many Christian filmmakers now, so we don't have to completely deny film to our children. But he's saying your child, probably a teenager, is going to want to see that Quentin Tarantino movie or whatever it may be. Compensate him somehow so that he might bear this deprivation, right, without resenting you too much. Do something else for him. Compensate him some other way. Don't make it a punishment, right? Make it no, we're not doing that. We're going to do this instead, and this is better. So I love that little piece of advice, because it just seems so spot on, right? It's so right here and now. So that's some of his advice. And I wanted to, we still have about 10 minutes, but I wanted to wrap up this vision of storytelling with one of the greatest storytellers with C.S. Lewis. And he discusses the literary person when he writes about writing and what the story does to the soul. And he holds up two images of sort of trying to explain what the literary person is. One is the teddy bear. He said the teddy bear is created to be a blank canvas for the child's imagination. Okay. The child can, quote, endow it with imaginary life and personality and enter into a quasi-social relationship with it. That's what playing with it means. Okay. So something's happening to the moral imagination of the child in playtime. Okay. Then he uses the sacred icon as another example. He says, it is not a vehicle or an object to use. That is not why the sacred icon is created. Okay. It is a way to pass through the material image and go beyond into a higher reality. Like he said, that's what great literature is meant to do too, or great art. Think fine art. It's meant to affect our soul and bring us to a higher moral reality. Great stories have this purpose also. And this is also C.S. Lewis. He says, the first reading of some literary work is often, to the literary person, an experience so momentous that only experiences of love, religion, or bereavement can furnish a standard of comparison. Their whole consciousness has changed. They have become what they were not before. So this is the impact that certain stories can have on us. It can be transforming. It could be spirit-filled. God can speak to us and change our hearts through going into this, other world, this other realm. Okay. And going back to St. John Chrysostom, he says, with these stories and 10,000 others, fortify his hearing as one of the gates to the city. Fortify his hearing. When he has heard the story often, ask him too, saying, tell me the story, so that he may be eager to imitate you. And when he has memorized it, you will also tell him how it profits him. The soul indeed, as it receives the story within itself, before you have elaborated it, is aware that it will benefit. So again, he's speaking to our moral capacities, that we're thirsting for the moral clarity that stories can bring us as a vehicle of truth, beauty, and goodness, of God's nature can come through. But they have to be the right stories. This is the purpose, really, of the Christian classical education, this idea of using the story to reach beyond to higher truths. To mold the character into something truly human, truly Christ-like. But this has to be done, again, in a grace-filled way through the power of the Spirit. So it's important what we are setting before our children. And it's important that our homes, which are safe havens, that they're the little church, right, are not filled with things that are garbage. It truly is the garbage in, garbage out. So we have to be cognizant of, do I have any books in my library which aren't going to serve this purpose? If you do, get rid of them. Get rid of them. They're stumbling blocks. They're snares. They're snares. Same with movies, right? There's some streaming channels that have perfectly good free options. But what are the commercials? So you have to be really careful, because the commercials are a narrative and a story too. It's all these little things, and you might be thinking, oh man, you're seeing a devil behind every rock. Well, that's because there is a devil behind every rock. So the older I get, the more and more I realize that you have to be very aware, because kids pick up on things so quickly, And by the time you realize what they've picked up, it's already happened, like probably, long before you were even aware of it. So yes, since St. John Chrysostom is very flexible with the meaning of with what a story is, it really is any vehicle for this vicarious practice. So again, be careful with the movies, even the music, the books, of course, whatever it is that you're placing around them or into their hands, because we've seen what a beautiful way God has used these to not only convert the soul to Him, but to bring us along on our path of theosis and our path towards Christ-likeness. So I talk about ascesis. It's very simple spiritual practices, but they're very hard to do. And I've talked about imitation, which seems a bit intimidating. This is one that I feel like is the most easy to grasp. Like, we could all do this. We could all provide great bedtime reads to our children, even if we're struggling with ascesis and we're struggling with imitation. Next week, which is my last, I'm going to take all three pillars and try to show you how they complement and correspond with each other, and they all work off each other. Spiritual exercise, imitation, and storytelling. Okay, so I'm going to try to bring everything together for you. Did you have a question?
I was just going to say that I've heard that devil behind any rock or every rock grave. I kind of cringe at it somewhat. I always think of it as there are a lot of rocks, and there are a lot of devils, and you don't know what devil is behind what rock. So you kind of have to treat it as though there's there's one behind every rock.
It's just that idea of being vigilant and cautious. So I think that phrase, you just see a devil behind every rock. I think it's usually used in a derogatory sense to try to sweep away any possible cautionary advice, or to imply that the person is somehow a zealot or fanatical. Well, yes, as parents in the little church, we have to be fanatically vigilant. Yeah. Because again, the devil doesn't even want you to be able to name him or even believe he's there. There's nothing there, right? So, so this is all I have for tonight. One more, and I hope everyone has a good weekend and a good evening. And that's it.